All right, so before we get into today's A segment, we thought we'd share a little bit of a cheat sheet, a primer, if you will, to bring you up to speed on the Visa Waiver Program. Now, the Visa Waiver Program started here in the United States in 1986. Currently, there are about 38 countries on the list. Now, initially, it was designed to sort of smooth the way for folks who wanted to come and do some tourism or a quick little business trip and stay in the United States for up to 90 days. Now, the thing is, you wouldn't have to apply for a visa if you're one of these 38 member countries. You could just sort of slip in and slip out. And we have reciprocity with those other nations. There are about 20 million people a year who come here using the visa program. The number one country is the UK, a longtime ally, of course. Japan is the second, with about 4 million people behind the UK's 4.1 million people. And Germany rounds out the top three, sending about 2 million people on the visa waiver program here a year. Now, the program brings about 20 million people in and supplies about $190 billion and supports 1 million jobs here in the U.S. And in 2014, there were $74 billion directly tied to that tourism from folks from those 38 countries. Now, a new bill that became a law that was introduced in December of last year, December 18th to be exact, H.R. 158, was introduced after the Paris and San Bernardino shootings. Now, what differentiates this bill is somewhere tucked in a spending bill that was designed to keep our government funded through September of this year. This question about citizenship and 4 specific countries came up, those being Iraq, Syria, Sudan, and Iran. Now, it excludes anyone who's been to those countries since 2011 from the quick visa waiver program. And the real kicker is, if you have dual citizenship, that means if you hold a passport from any of those 4 countries, you also don't qualify for that citizenship for the waiver program, and you have to regularly get into the queue that any person from a non-member company would. It passed the House with 407 votes in favor, and only 19 people stood up and said no. 10 days later, President Obama signed the law. Well, Aaron is going to introduce our guests who are going to bring us a little bit more insight into the issue, and he's with them now.
Joining us now to give us more details on this complex issue is Murtaza Hussain, a journalist with The Intercept, who recently wrote about the discriminatory nature of the bill. Welcome to BK Live.
Thanks for having me.
And we're also pleased to meet Keyvan Afshari, the Brooklyn-based Director of Communications for the American-Iranian Council, a think tank dedicated to improving U.S.-Iran relations since 1990. And great to have you both here, gentlemen.
Glad to be here.
Okay. Thanks. Now, Brian gave us a brief breakdown of H.R. 158, but Murtaza, can you give us an idea of what the impact might be here and abroad?
Well, let's take a hypothetical situation. Say you're a person of Iranian descent, or say Sudanese descent, or Syrian or Iraqi descent, and you want to travel to Europe. Now, you're an American born, you've lived your whole life in the United States, and you're a passport holder. Theoretically now, under the ramifications of this bill, Europe could decline to give you visa-free travel like any other American citizen. Because with H.R. 158, European citizens have lost that right to travel if they're of descent of those countries. And that triggers reciprocity as part of the visa waiver provisions. So theoretically, you could be creating a class of dual citizenship, whereas people from certain countries, if their parents are from those countries, they'll be a lower class of citizen. And if you want to travel to Europe or other places, you'll be denied the same rights that other Americans have.
So, Keyvan, we woke up to news about a terrorist attack in Turkey that people are blaming on a Syrian national. Syria is one of these 4 countries. So, weighing that news against these concerns here in America about people having free reign versus safety, how do you think that's going to affect the public sentiment on this bill?
Yeah, well, I think that, there certainly are steps that they're taking with this ostensible goal of increasing national security. But what confuses me by this bill is the inclusion of Iran in this law. It doesn't really make sense, right? And by doing so, it manages to be both thoroughly discriminatory and, I would argue, completely inefficacious as well. That is to say, it will not increase national security 1 iota. It's discriminatory because there are many, like thousands and thousands of people who travel to Iran. I was just there a few months ago, and there are German, Italian, European, French, British tourists all over Esfahan and other beautiful sites that people go to Iran to see tourism and historical sites. None of them are going and committing terrorism afterwards. And it's also inefficacious to the extent that there's no phenomenon of people going to Iran and becoming radicalized and consequently committing acts of terrorism in the West. That's just not a phenomenon that's taking place. So you're discriminating and you're not increasing national security at all by including Iran in this bill, in this law, excuse me. The reason that Iran was included was because they list the states that are on the state sponsors of terrorism list, which Iran has been on since 1986 for its support of Hezbollah. So that makes me think that the putative goal of increasing national security isn't really the driving factor behind including Iran. It's more about the relationship between the United States and Iran and putting increasing pressure on Iran, which, ever since the nuclear accord, the JCPOA, the trajectory has been arguably more positive on U.S.-Iran relations.
So you're not against the law. You just don't want Iran on the list?
I am against the law. I am, but I also understand that, there are some steps that could be, like if someone were to travel to a specific geographical location that is known to be an ISIS training camp, right? I mean, I think most people would reasonably say that that person who traveled there needs to go through extra security. That's a reasonable step. So in this broad debate between civil liberties and national security, I am not on the extreme of either of those sides. I'm trying to think about what a smart policy that limits discrimination and manages to provide a reasonable amount of national security. It will probably never be perfect, sadly. There are some reasonable aspects to it. So if you go to the specific training camp, yeah, naturally, you should face extra security. And unfortunately, through many factors, many unfortunate causes, there is a phenomenon of radicalization taking place at ISIS training camps. So in certain parts of Syria and Iraq, that is taking place. But the inclusion of Iran it doesn't fit that bill at all.
Murtaz, I have to ask you, how will this affect humanitarian efforts? Because so many of these places, are places of crisis. And so, there's refugees in Syria, but, how does this affect humanitarian efforts from a global perspective?
So one of the most troubling aspects of the bill is the fact that not only does it affect national origins, it affects people who, as mentioned, travel to these zones and without discrimination. So if you're a journalist, an aid worker, someone else involved in humanitarian work in those regions, you are also affected and you will lose your visa-free right to travel. So consequently, it's a big break on those sort of individuals who are trying to ameliorate the situation there and try to bring it to some reasonable conclusion. Furthermore, there's an aspect which Kayvon alluded to that it seems this bill has been targeted to a moment of undermining U.S. and Iranian relations because the ramifications of the bill also affect the Iran nuclear deal potentially. So hypothetically, again, say you're a British or a Japanese businessman and you want to travel to Iran to take advantage of the newly opened economic environment. By doing so, you forfeit your right to travel to the United States later on visa-free. So it acts as an effective economic sanction against Iran without actually being called one, and that's what makes it very troubling. And the fact that, Syria and Iraq, we could disagree, but it's reasonable, I think, to say that there are fears and people traveling to ISIS territory. We need to stop that. But the inclusion of Iran is totally gratuitous and baffling in some ways.
And I just want to dovetail off that also. I mean, there is a specific clause in the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, that is the nuclear accord that they adopted. That it's Article 29 that says, I'm paraphrasing, but essentially that the P5+1 powers shall make no policies that are intended to directly adversely affect the normalization of trade with Iran. Yeah. And it's arguable that this is a violation. I mean, there is an argument there. I don't want to say that for sure it is, because I think that the U.S. could find some loophole there. But I mean, it certainly is against the spirit of the JCPOA to enact this.
Well, speaking of spirit, we've seen the letter that John Kerry wrote, and maybe there might be some backpedaling there to say, okay, we want to normalize relations, but we're going to stick it to you with the visa thing. So I just wanted to know, like, Maz, you're out and you take the temperature of just everyday folks on these issues as well. Are everyday Americans as concerned as the government would lead us to believe about people who come from Iran?
I think Iran, not so much.
Do we even know? Like, are we happy to be dumb and they're all from over there?
Fears of terrorism are so overblown. Like you said, they tend to not be thoroughly defined or nuanced or, specific. And unfortunately, people get lumped all over there. But it's incumbent upon people in government whose job is to, implement responsible and effective policies, that they should not succumb to the same sort of tendencies. And I really think that the inclusion of Iran, it has to be some sort of, if not malicious, then cynical attempt to undermine these relations which are on the uptick. And I think it bodes very poorly because if Obama is going to leave in the next year or so, the nuclear deal was his one of his legacies of his administration, especially if another government comes in which is hostile to his legacy, say a Republican government. This could be a first indicator of measures they'll take to undermine that deal and potentially put us back on the path to conflict with Iran after so much time and energy had been spent to divert us from that potentially disastrous course.
So if Iran wasn't one of the four, would we be having this conversation?
That's a good question. I think that there would still be a conversation to be had, but it would be a very kind of nuanced conversation, and good arguments could be made on both sides, and we'd be having certainly a very different conversation, I would say.
Do you think the fact that we're sort of in a presidential year and there's a lot of rhetoric sort of being just, and vitriol just being, spewed all over our television, polarizing though that it is, does that sort of affect this conversation and to the point of it affecting Congress?
Absolutely. And despite that, though, this bill is so incendiary in its details.
We keep calling it a bill. It's a law now, unfortunately. I do the same thing. So
it's not under the
Yes, I wish.
Sad to say. So essentially, they had to slip this in an omnibus bill. So even the fact that, like you said, correctly noted, there's so much hysteria and hyperbole, the details are so inflammatory and so deleterious to normal policy making that they had to slide it in at the last moment. And I think even Obama and John Kerry and others, when they realized what's going to happen, there was alarm and there was an attempt to do damage control, because I think that it really did cross the line. For that reason, they had to do it in a way which was a bit sneakier and more secretive than usual.
So are we safer, Kayvon, for having this law?
No, absolutely not. Totally inefficacious. Doesn't increase national security. Well, I mean, again, like going back to like specific geographical locations where people may travel, yes, to that extent. But in terms of the addition of Iran to it, not at all. But I wanted to continue on what you were talking about with kind of the rhetoric that's taking place right now. And I mean, there certainly is a kind of anti-Muslim, I would just say, plainly speaking, an anti-Brown kind of current in American politics, unfortunately, right now. And there's many reasons for that. But I want to say, in terms of this bill, people will sometimes say, well, all you have to do is apply for a visa, right? It's a minor inconvenience. But to me, the reason I'm so affronted by this is not about that inconvenience. I mean, it is true. If the EU reciprocates and my friends and I want to go,
It's just one more thing to do before your trip.
right? And so if my friends and I want to go on a Euro trip, I would be the only one of them, as an American citizen, in fact, who would have to apply for a visa. That's an inconvenience, but it's really not just about the inconvenience. It's about the implication of this, and the implication of it is that by being an Iranian-American dual citizen, someone who has traveled to Iran, that I may perhaps be a terrorist. That's the reason that it's such an affront to civil rights and to equal rights, and why I'm passionately against this.
So just to backtrack for a second, the thing that's mind-boggling to me is the fact, like you said, it was in an omnibus thing. Like they say, you know what, if you want to keep the lights on in the government through September of this year, just sign yes to this thing. So it just makes you wonder how many layers of things are going to come back to bite us in the ass that we voted for.
It's
just
anti-democratic.
Absolutely.
It's anti-democratic.
to keep the lights on.
Absolutely. It's deeply, deeply troubling that that's the way that they had to broach the subject.
Yeah.
And I think that, unfortunately, the political rhetoric of certain individuals, Donald Trump only being the most bombastic of them.
His name.
Right.
We don't do that.
He who shall not be named. He is only the most bombastic and sort of loud of those people engaging this rhetoric. But across the spectrum, people are saying things like Chris Christie said we need to ban all Syrian refugees, including up to and including orphans.
Yeah.
Jeb Bush, Ted Cruz, and others have echoed similar sentiments. And now you're seeing the government actually legislating those ideas, or beginning to legislate those ideas. And in 2016, we're anticipating a raft of further measures. We don't know the specifics yet, but there are indications that there are going to be further discriminatory immigration and migration laws proposed in the United States. And it's going to be a really tough battle, because we've had experiences like this before in the United States, in the Asian exclusion laws, laws targeting refugees from Europe during World War II. And we're going through the same cycle once more, and it's important to be tenacious and to be on guard for the same sort of demagogues and irresponsible populists that we've seen in the past.
So in our last 30 seconds, I'm going to ask you each about your opinion of when the rubber is really going to meet the road on this, when we're actually going to see impact and ramifications as Americans.
I think it comes down really to whether they actually implement it or not. And there are laws that sometimes are in the books but just don't get implemented. And this, in fact, especially the dual national clause, will be very difficult to implement. It'll be very hard to just, for Border Patrol to just determine if somebody is also an Iranian citizen. So it may not actually be implemented. The clause about people who have traveled to those 4 countries will certainly be easier to implement because you will likely see it on their passport. So it may not actually, again, be fully implemented and have the horrible consequences. But to me, again, it's really more about the precedent that it's setting and the implication behind this law. So that's why I object to it.
Last word.
I really second the part about the precedent because it does create the possibility of a tiered citizenship effectively, and that can be a very dangerous road to go down. I'm also very concerned about the nuclear deal because the Iranian government has taken note of the fact that this has happened, and the position of Iranian hardliners who oppose the deal has always been the United States is going to impose sanctions anyway. So you can negotiate this deal, but they'll put the sanctions back on. And any indication that that could be happening is very troubling to people on both sides who are trying to find a reasonable solution. And it empowers the people who want to tank the deal, both in Iran and the United States. And that's something which I hope doesn't come to pass, but it's something which it's a poor leading indicator on that front.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you for talking about it, too. We appreciate Brick TV taking a platform to talk about this stuff. That's great.
I urge you, employ you to read Maz's article on The Intercept about it. It's enlightening.
Oh, thank you.
Great article.
Thank you.
Great article.
Appreciate
Thank you so much.